All right. Welcome to this month's episode of Conservation Conversations. I'm Sean O'Brien, President and CEO of NatureServe. And I'm super excited this month to have Dudley Edmondson with me. Dudley sort of has my dream job. Don't tell my board that. But when I was growing up, I always wanted to be a wildlife photographer, and I didn't see the path. And so we're going to find out how Dudley managed to navigate that path and become a successful wildlife photographer. Dudley is also an author and has written a book, Black and Brown Faces in America's Wild Places, which is quite interesting. And I'm going to ask you about a couple things in there. And you have done a number of other things that we're going to just sort of get to as we go through the conversation, because I think that's a much more fun way to get to know you than for me to just monologue about you when you're right here and you can talk about yourself.
Yeah, no, that sounds perfect. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great that you're here. So we're going to do the opposite of what I want to talk about.
Okay.
In one of your essays, you wrote about silence and the first time you experienced true silence. And we're going to talk instead of experience silence in this situation. But I wanted you to just revisit that moment, because I think it's so rare in the world today to ever be in a place that's truly quiet.
Yeah. And for me, a kid growing up in Columbus, Ohio, hustle bustle kind of town, I really wasn't accustomed to spaces that didn't have man-made sound or any sound of any kind. And so, as a young person, I was just really kind of felt like I didn't really belong in an urban space. Once I discovered nature as a small child, and that sort of therapeutic piece that's part of it in terms of it, your mental and physical health is just improved by, immersing yourself in the natural world on a regular basis. And so, I got this sort of wanderlust, whatever you want to call it, but just wanted to move around and be in spaces and experience new things and new types of habitat and environment. And so I drove out to Badlands National Park in South Dakota. Mm-hmm. And in that space, which was very different from Columbus, Ohio.
Yes.
all the dried buttes and so somewhat arid landscape. And I recall, some point getting out of the car and walking in and amongst the buttes. And then I stopped, and then I noticed all I could hear was my own heart beating, and it freaked me out for a split second. And at first, I remember putting my fingers in my ears to confirm what I was hearing. And then I took them out, and that's what it was. It was almost like somebody had, basically hit the mute button to nature. Right. And all I could hear was my own heart. And it was a very liberating thing, but it also made me hungry to be in spaces like that more and more.
Yeah. And what's interesting is in that situation, you were in a landscape that didn't have a lot of insects and birds, obviously. Mm-hmm. But even to be able to be in a space where all you hear are insects and birds and the rustling of animals in the undergrowth or whatever is so rare. And I know you're a person who can identify birds by ear. And so being in a place where you didn't even hear a bird that you could go, oh, I got that one. Must have been really interesting.
Yeah, and one of my favorite types of habitat really is prairie. Even though I live in, here in northern Minnesota, just a couple hundred miles south of the Canadian border, it's mostly boreal forest and big lakes. Mm-hmm. But western Minnesota has quite a bit of prairie habitat, and on prairies, that's one of the things that is a good thing to hear is insects and birds, particularly insects. If you're not hearing insects on the prairie, then there's particularly June, July, there's a major problem, because those insects are such a huge part of the ecosystem, feeding all the birds, nesting birds and things that are there.
Sure.
and part of the vegetation as well. But
Right.
they're special places to be, because I think that the average human being doesn't get a chance to experience that, and I feel like it changes you. It gives you a sense of, a perspective of what you mean and sort of who you are in the world. And it also makes you feel really small and insignificant, which for some people that might hurt, but for me, it felt great.
It's an important experience to have.
It's a very important experience to have.
And you mentioned earlier about sort of the mental health benefits of being out in nature, and I know you talk about that in other places, and how that was something that you did when you were younger, even though we hadn't studied it yet, to know that going out into nature was going to be good for you. And so that experience, I think, probably was pretty special. And it's one that, as we think about parklands and wilderness areas and places that people can go around the world to experience nature, that is super important. And then, of course, access to those places is really important.
Yeah, I mean, access to green space, whether people know it or not, is super important to one's mental health. And whether it's urban green space or quote unquote wilderness, any of that is really good for the mind. Sometimes people don't even know why they like the colors blue and green, why they have a lake cabin, why they like being on the ocean. I mean, it's like, I think people don't understand that is just part of who you are as an organism living on planet Earth, that you would find these places to be, pleasant and restorative. But most people don't really acknowledge or realize that is part of a connection to nature. And I think it's just part of being an organism on planet Earth, really.
Yeah, that connection is really interesting. I went on a hike last summer in the Olympic Peninsula up this rather rugged terrain that was several miles, and it was not an easy climb, but you get to the top and there's this beautiful landscape, not unlike what's behind you, with a lake, and you can see out into the sound, and there are mountains. And I was looking around at the people and I was like, all of these people just did something really, really hard just so they could look at this scene. There's no other return on that investment other than looking at that scene. And they're all like quiet and watching and just sort of looking and being in this space together. And it was sort of magical. And it made me think about the desire that you were just expressing about to go to beaches and to look at big expanses of water and to see large landscapes, and thinking about what that means as humans and why it's so important that we have natural places and that everyone feels welcome in these natural places is an important part of it.
Yeah, I mean, the welcome piece is definitely super important, particularly as we move into a future of the population demographics in America are constantly changing, and I mean, already white youth under the age of 18 are a minority in the United States, and that number is going to continue to change. And as people of color's numbers continue to grow, I think that it's important for up and coming populations and groups of people to feel that sense of ownership about public lands or indigenous lands. In order for people to be good stewards, they have to have a connection to those spaces, a sense of ownership, and feeling as though they're part of who they are. And those are things I think that oftentimes within white families, those things get passed down over generations. And I think that for families of color, those are traditions that we will have to continue in order to be able to appreciate those spaces.
Right. And it was remarkable in your book, the number of stories of people talking about being in what we sometimes refer to as wilderness. And I was thinking about how for many of the people you interviewed in the book, wilderness was a scary place and it was wild, right?
Right.
And for me growing up, wilderness was an exciting place to go and to see really amazing things. And for other cultures, say indigenous people, Native Americans, it's just home. It's
Right.
not wilderness. This is just where we live. This is where my people are from. And
Right.
so it's really thinking about the different ways that one word impacts just three of the kinds of groups of people that we have. Never mind, every other way that we can slice and dice our population. Really makes it interesting to think about how do we make our natural spaces welcoming to the most people possible so that everyone can have the opportunities that you've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, how do we manage them in the future? Are things going to be different? Sometimes with people of color, we prefer to recreate in large groups. We're not the soloist types that generally speaking. I mean, and I don't want to speak for every group, but I'm just saying what I know about at least my group of folks is that, we tend to love to do things in whole families, multiple generations of people, which is kind of different from sometimes the way that things, public lands have been managed and facilities, are available, not necessarily always for large groups of people. So that's, something to take into consideration in the future as our population demographics shift. So
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
In your PBS segment, you talked about being out in nature and how it made you feel when you closed your eyes, and you described it as a feeling of freedom. And in Black and Brown Faces in America's Wild Places, the word liberty came up, and I thought that was a really interesting concept. And I just wanted to have you talk a little bit about like that sense of freedom that you have when you were in that moment with your eyes closed out in nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it comes from, I know as a person of color in the United States of America, liberty and freedom doesn't necessarily, I don't think that people of color have the same level of liberty and freedom as white people do. I feel like our liberty and freedom is subject to the opinions of white America, of what freedoms we actually are allowed to have. I mean, even the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, I mean, those are all things that have to be talked about and discussed again. And
Right.
so I feel like that the sense of freedom, for at least for me, is being in a space where I don't feel like there's any kinds of the rules and regulations and the structures that come from urban spaces don't really matter in that space. I mean, this photo behind me I took in Cascades National Park a number of years ago, and I feel like in that space I have way more freedom than I do walking down the street in Manhattan or Washington, D.C. I'm not being judged in the space behind me. I don't feel as though I have to perform or be a certain kind of person, a friendly Black person, a person that doesn't intimidate or threaten white people.
Mm-hmm.
That in the space that you see behind me, I have the freedom to just be me. But if I'm in an urban space, in and around people, I have to be something else.
Yeah.
That causes a level of stress for people of color.
That's really interesting and really powerful. And perhaps before we go off into some lighter topics, I just want to acknowledge that, when I'm listening to you talk, I'm becoming acutely aware of the sort of privilege that I've had to not have those feelings that you're talking about, where in most spaces that I go to, I don't have a sense of I need to do certain things to be accepted, or to have people not say things to me that would be horrible for them to say, or to do things to me that would be horrible for them to do. And I'm just always want to acknowledge that I'm aware of that. And one of the things that's so great about talking with you and having read through the stories of the people in your book is developing that awareness and that understanding so that we can work together to figure out how to make natural spaces and all spaces, but we're here talking about nature, natural spaces more welcoming and more open to a broader range of people.
Yeah. I mean, and I appreciate you acknowledging that. It's the kind of thing, I mean, it's part of really systemic racism in America makes it so that people of color, nearly just about everything, any privileges, or if you even want to call them that, any rights that we have are all subject to what white America believes that we should have.
Right. Given to you as opposed to presumed to be self-inherent.
Exactly. And at times I feel like white people's sense of freedom is the ability to be able to determine other people's freedoms. That sense of freedom is that I get to determine what your freedoms are. So that's my freedom as a white person. I'm saying that to me is in a nutshell what it is. And for people of color, I feel like our freedoms, we understand that they're more or less up for debate almost on a regular basis. I mean, even the things the country's going through right now. I mean, you're seeing how this redistricting things are being done, removing Black people's, right to vote in certain southern states and things. But yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, I feel like for white people, that is freedom. Your freedom is you get to decide what my freedom is.
Right. That is so interesting. And for people who know a little bit about my background, I used to work at the home of James Madison. It's called Montpelier in Virginia, and therefore have thought a lot about the Constitution and the writing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and what that means in terms of the structure of America and the kinds of things that we're talking about right now, which are kind of a different topic, but really important topic when we're thinking about conservation of places. And I was thinking also, so you're just a tiny bit older than me. Because I looked at the year you were born. And what that means, though, is that you have been on the leading edge in a lot of places that you've been in terms of being a person of color who's a wildlife photographer, who is an expert birder and is going into all of these remote places. That's, despite some of the amazing stories of people in the past, you're on that leading edge of people seeing, oh, look, there's an African-American man out here.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And that has been, something in the past, people taking pictures of me because I'm in a space and I'm there as a photographer photographing wildlife, and people are photographing me because I'm a Black man in a wilderness space. And my philosophy has always been I belong where I choose to be. And that is something I've lived by most of my adult life. Once I started to wander around the country, I mean, most of my early trips, when I lived in Columbus, were almost always to the East Coast, Chesapeake Bay, going to see, my bird migration in the fall. And I found myself in spaces where people were like looking at me like, and this was back in the early 80s. People were looking at me like I didn't belong, but it's like, hey, there's ruddy turnstones here. There's red knots. I'm here to see the birds. And, if you don't like me being here, then that's a problem you will have to figure out. But right now I've got to go look at these birds. So good luck.
So I like that. I've got to go look at these birds because I'm really curious how you discovered that it was possible to be a wildlife photographer, and then that could be a career, and how you actually made that happen. Because I think that that's a really challenging thing to do, to be successful at.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I got super lucky. I mean, I originally I thought I wanted to be a wildlife biologist. Thought I wanted to be a game warden, all of these different things that I wanted to be able to make a living in, and stay connected to the natural world and things. But I realized that at some point, I figured I'd end up with a desk job in some administration position. And I kind of just hated math. So to be honest, and I figured with being a scientist or whatever, at some point you're going to get hit over the head with some heavy math. And I wasn't wanting to have that concussion. So I just decided that it would be a lot easier to make a career path. And I chose wildlife photography because it gave me the opportunity to both be creative as well as having a connection to the natural world.
Yeah.
And so I just, I pursued it. It was all in the early days. It was all about birds of prey. And then, in 89, 90, I moved to Minnesota to put serious roots down as a wildlife photographer. And Duluth, Minnesota, where I am now, seemed like the best place to be. Because there's so much wild spaces and public land here. I mean, even in my little suburban neighborhood, I mean, I know there's a wolf pack that, probably takes care of the area. I've had bald eagles in my front yard or backyard and front yard, bears sitting on my front steps, black bears eating out of my bird feeder that it ripped off of the post, fox, both gray and reds. So it just feels like this is where I belong, in a space where I have easy access to nature.
Yeah.
But even then, it took me 4 or 5 years before I actually got my real opportunity to be a nature photographer. And that was working with my friend Stan Tequila, who writes a number of bird books. And books in general. I mean, he's written literally hundreds of books at this point in his life. But Birds of Minnesota was the first book we worked on. And at that time, he wasn't a photographer. And so he hired me to photograph his books. And so he and I would travel, he would write, I would photograph. And eventually I taught him how to be a good photographer. And now that's, a major part of what he does these days is quite a bit of photography. But so that he gave me my real break in nature photography. And, we worked together for many years working on those books. And so I at that time I was kind of working with him, and now the tables have turned. He's working with me. I do video production work for clients, and he works with me as our sound engineer and our drone pilot. So
Nice.
So that's kind of how it turned.
And you're at some point in your career, you sort of went from strict wildlife photography into sort of backcountry adventure type of work, and now your videography is what are you focusing on there?
Yeah, I mean, most of the work I do these days, I'm working on projects now. I just finished a couple of films. I did a shot last year. I went to the Arctic Circle with a bunch of folks, and we shot a fly fishing. It's a combination, a film called Black Waters that'll premiere in August in Portland. And it's a film about 5 black fly fishermen fishing in the Arctic, but also talking about blackness, black male masculinity. It's a really interesting film. And just I shot and edited that. And so most of my projects still deal with with the outdoors, with people of color. But yeah, my film work is a lot of conservation stuff. I've done a lot of stuff for the Nature Conservancy, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Any of the initiatives and things that they do.
Right.
So, but yeah, it's a
So,
hodgepodge.
well, Dudley, what else do you want people to know about nature and the making nature a welcoming space for everyone? And I want to give you a chance to sort of, because you clearly have thought about these things a lot and spent time writing about them. And so I want to give you a little moment to use a soapbox and talk about the things that you really are passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that comes to mind really is the importance of pollinators and plants, really. For me, those are things that most people don't think about. The fact that 1 in 3 bites of food they eat on a daily basis is made possible by pollinators.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I see all of these, ads and products for killing insects, it just makes me sad to think that people don't realize how important insects are to their daily lives. I mean, there's no one that's ever probably lived on this planet that the food that they ate wasn't made possible by insects and plants. Because I tell people all the time is that you either eat the plant or you eat the animal that eats the plant. That's the only way you will ever get it. Until humans can face the sun and turn that energy into sugar and the whole thing that plants do, then we will always be dependent upon plants and pollinators.
That is a great message. Pollinators are incredibly challenged in the world today, and as you indicated, we're completely dependent on them for our survival. And so NatureServe spends a lot of time working with different agencies and different organizations on tracking and understanding the threats and the challenges facing pollinators, because it is real. And
it's very real.
Many of the things you talked about with pesticides and all are just making it worse, and habitat transformation. So I have one last question for you, and that is about sort of legacy. So what do you want your grandchildren or your grandnieces and nephews or someone from a future generation to say that Dudley Edmondson was able to contribute to the world?
Yeah, I mean, he was a giving person, sharing of knowledge and helping people. There are a number of young men around the country who think of me that are not related to me, but they think of me as an uncle or a dad. And
that's lovely.
Because we've spent time together and I've worked with them and helped them, at their request to do things. And, the thing I try to instill in all of them is that you have an obligation now to go help someone else. And very recently, one young man who lives in LA now reached out to me, left a message thanking me for having been there for him, and helped him, figure out some things as a Black male in America, while he was graduating from high school in his early years of college and everything. And he said, it was something he hadn't thought about until a young man asked him very recently how he became the person he became. And he said, there was this guy back in Minnesota named Dudley who mentored me. And so now he realizes that now he's going to become a mentor to this young man. And so it's like, I guess maybe that's it. Just that, I feel like I have an obligation to be, to pass on my knowledge and experience and skills or whatever to new generations of young men of color, specifically, part of this is also you have a responsibility to
Right.
do the same thing I'm doing for you. You have to do that in the future, because if you don't, you're a jerk. That's basically what I tell them. I say, if you don't pass your knowledge forward, like I'm passing to you, you're a jerk. And whether that has an effect on them or not, I don't know. But it's like, it just seems like it's the right thing to do.
For sure. Yeah.
And that's what I feel like what I'm doing is the right thing to do.
And you're working on that actually somewhat specifically with the fellowship program. Is that right?
Well, no. The fellowship program is a program that is designed to give a stipend to students of color who want to pursue environmental education careers. And it's been a number of years since that was established. And, it's not something I'm directly involved with. It's a friend of mine with the Greater Seattle YMCA sort of asked me and decided he wanted to name it in my honor. And it was interesting. I've met some of the fellows of a one class, and they said that you're not a dead old white man. And I was like, typically, and these are all obviously students of color, but when something has someone's name in it, typically it's attached to a philanthropic dead white guy. Yeah. And so there I was. And we had a little laugh about that, but
the old pale male and frail.
Yeah. So it was it does have some components there that could be helpful in the future. But yeah, I don't know. I just think that we're currently, it just feels like a loop to me as I'm watching it.
It is exciting to see young people of color coming into the field and seeing more people interested in the field who are come from diverse backgrounds. They're not just white people like me. And I think that's exciting, and it's going to change the conversations a lot, because people will be coming in with different perspectives and different ways of thinking about things, and we'll have more creative solutions. We'll have solutions that people like me never would have thought of. And so I think it's an exciting time. And I want to thank you for being on the show this month, and also for all that you're doing for raising awareness and understanding and paying it forward into future generations. I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
And if people are interested in Dudley's work, they can find you online at dudleyedmondson.com, right? Yep. Is there any other way that they should find you online?
My Instagram is also probably where most of my new, things are going to be. I mean,
great. Well, we hope you get more followers from talking with us here today.
Yeah.
And I want to thank everyone for listening to Conservation Conversations this month. NatureServe is a nonprofit organization, and we're welcoming of donations to the organization to support the work we do to protect biodiversity and talk about issues like we were talking about today with Dudley. And of course, you're always welcome to rate the podcast on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps with awareness and visibility of the show for other users and other listeners. So thanks for listening. And thanks again to Dudley. I hope that I get to come up to your neck of the woods sometime in the next couple of years and go out and look at birds with you.
Yeah, you're welcome anytime.
Awesome. Thanks so much.